When the powerful cattle baron's twin sons cried inconsolably every night after their mother's death, the entire household felt helpless, until Clara, a quiet Irish maid, dared to cross the forbidden line between servant and family. But what she did in that candlelit nursery would challenge everything the Montana Territory's high society believed about love, class, and who truly deserves to matter. Would her act of compassion destroy her life, or transform it forever? Clara Murphy's bare feet hit the cold wooden floor as screams tore through the Montana ranch house like thunder on a clear day. The clock on the kitchen wall showed midnight, but sleep had become a stranger to everyone in the Hartwell mansion since the terrible spring of 1879 when the mistress died. The Irish maid pressed her ear against the servant door, counting the seconds between each heartbreaking cry. Little William's voice cracked with exhaustion, while baby Edmund's wails shook the very walls of the grand house. For 6 long months, this same scene played out every single night, turning the once happy home into a place where shadows seemed to whisper of sadness. "Those poor babies," muttered old Pete, the ranch foreman, as he shuffled through the kitchen for his late-night coffee. His weathered hands shook slightly as he poured the dark liquid. "Ain't natural, all that crying. Makes a man's heart ache, something fierce." Clara nodded, her green eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. Back in County Cork, before the Great Hunger drove her family across the ocean, she had helped raise 7 younger brothers and sisters. She knew the sound of children who needed more than food and warm blankets. These boys needed something their father's money couldn't buy. The Montana Territory stretched for miles beyond the ranch, wild and beautiful under the star-filled sky. Cattle dotted the endless grasslands like dark spots on a green blanket, and the Rocky Mountains stood guard in the distance. This was cattle country, where men built empires from nothing but grass, water, and determination. Robert Hartwell had done exactly that, creating one of the largest ranches in the territory. But all his success meant nothing when it came to healing 2 broken little hearts. Clara had arrived at the ranch just 3 weeks after Margaret Hartwell's funeral. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Henderson, had hired her to work in the kitchens and help with cleaning. The pay was fair, the work honest, and Clara was grateful for both. Irish immigrants weren't always welcome in Montana, but the Hartwells needed help, and she needed a job. What she hadn't expected was to fall in love with the sound of children's laughter echoing through the halls during the day, or to feel her heart break every night when that laughter turned to tears. "Master Hartwell looks terrible," whispered Jenny, the young parlor maid, as she entered the kitchen with a tray of untouched food. He barely ate 2 bites of dinner again, just sat there staring at his wife's empty chair. Clara had seen the master of the house only a handful of times since her arrival. Robert Hartwell was a tall man with broad shoulders and hands that showed years of hard work. His dark hair was streaked with early gray, and his brown eyes held a sadness that seemed to go deeper than the earth itself. He moved through his own home like a ghost, present, but not really living. The children's cries grew louder, and Clara found herself moving toward the main part of the house before she could stop herself. Her hand touched the brass doorknob that separated the servants' quarters from the family's living area. She had never crossed this line before. Servants knew their place, especially immigrant servants who should be thankful for any work at all. "Where are you going?" Mrs. Henderson appeared like a shadow, her stern face made even more serious by the flickering candlelight. The head housekeeper ruled the staff with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. She was fair but firm, kind but strict about the rules. "I thought maybe." Clara's voice trailed off as another wave of crying crashed down from the second floor. "You thought wrong," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Master Hartwell has made it very clear that no one is to interfere with his children. He's handling things his own way." But handling and helping were 2 very different things, Clara thought, as she watched the older woman's face soften with worry. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had worked for wealthy families her entire life, seemed troubled by the nightly symphony of sadness that filled the house. "They're just babies," Clara whispered, her Irish accent growing thicker with emotion. Little ones who lost their mama and don't understand why the world suddenly became so dark and scary. Mrs. Henderson's expression grew gentler, but her voice remained firm. That may be true, but they're not our babies to comfort. That's their father's job. As if summoned by their conversation, heavy footsteps echoed overhead. Robert Hartwell was pacing again, walking back and forth across the nursery floor like a caged wolf. Clara had heard those same footsteps every night, wearing a path in the expensive carpet as he tried everything he could think of to calm his sons. Nothing worked. The crying continued, punctuated now by the sound of furniture being moved. Clara could picture the scene. A desperate father trying rocking chairs in different positions, adjusting blankets, checking for fevers, singing half-remembered lullabies in a voice rough with grief and frustration. "He's a good man, Mrs. Fore," Henderson said quietly, as if reading Clara's thoughts. "But losing his wife nearly killed him. He's doing his best with those boys. But his best isn't enough." Clara finished the sentence that hung in the air like smoke. Dawn broke over the Montana grasslands like spilled gold, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made the endless prairie look like something from a fairy tale. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching the sunrise, while her hands automatically kneaded bread dough for the day's meals. She had been awake since the children finally quieted around 4 in the morning, unable to return to sleep after hearing their heartbroken sobs. The house felt different in daylight. Sunbeams danced through tall windows, highlighting the expensive furniture and beautiful paintings that decorated every room. Fresh flowers from Margaret's garden still graced the tables, though their petals had begun to droop with neglect. It was hard to believe that such a lovely place could hold so much sadness. "Morning, Clara," called Tom, one of the ranch hands, as he stomped through the back door with mud on his boots and a smile on his weathered face. "Coffee ready yet?" "Always is for you, cowboys," Clara replied, grateful for the cheerful interruption to her worried thoughts. She poured the strong, dark coffee into a tin cup and handed it to him. "How are the cattle this morning? Fat and happy?" "Just like we like them," Tom grinned, taking a long sip. "Boss has us moving the herd to the south pasture today. Grass is getting short up north with all this dry weather." Clara nodded, though her mind wasn't really on cattle or pastures. Through the kitchen's interior window, she could see into the main hallway, where family portraits lined the walls. The largest painting showed Robert and Margaret Hartwell on their wedding day, both young and radiant with hope. Margaret's blonde hair caught the light like spun silk, and her blue eyes sparkled with joy and love. How different things were now. "Shame about those little ones," Tom said, following her gaze. "Heard them crying again last night. Keeps the whole bunkhouse awake sometimes, when the wind's just right." "The whole ranch hears them," Clara murmured, her heart aching at the thought of how far the children's grief had spread. Tom finished his coffee and headed back outside, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts and the bread that needed her attention. She worked automatically, her hands shaping loaves, while her mind wandered to her own childhood in Ireland. She remembered her baby sister crying during the long, cold nights when their father was away looking for work. Her mother had sung old Irish songs to calm the little one, melodies that had been passed down through generations like precious jewels. Maybe. The thought came so suddenly that Clara almost dropped the bread dough. Her grandmother's lullabies had soothed babies for hundreds of years. The gentle melodies and soft words in the old language seemed to reach something deep inside frightened children that English couldn't touch. "What if?" "Stop it," she whispered to herself. "That's not your place." But the idea had taken root like a seed in fertile soil, growing stronger with each passing moment. She found herself humming one of the old songs under her breath, a melody about brave little princes who conquered their fears and slept peacefully through the darkest nights. The morning hours passed quickly as the household came to life around her. Mrs. Henderson directed the daily cleaning with military precision, while Jenny and the other maids bustled about with dusters and mops. The cook, Mrs. Patterson, arrived from her cottage near the barn and immediately began planning the day's meals with Clara's help. "Master Hartwell wants his breakfast in his study again," Mrs. Patterson announced, tying her apron strings with practiced efficiency. "Says he has paperwork to catch up on, but we all know he just can't bear to sit at that big dining room table alone." Clara prepared the breakfast tray with extra care, adding a small vase with wildflowers she had picked during her morning walk. It was a tiny gesture, but sometimes tiny gestures were the most important ones of all. As she carried the tray through the main hallway, Clara caught her first glimpse of the children since her arrival 3 weeks ago. William, barely 3 years old, sat on the bottom step of the grand staircase, clutching a wooden horse that had seen better days. His blonde hair stuck up in all directions, and his blue eyes, so like his mother's, were red from crying. Baby Edmund, not quite 2, crawled around the polished floor nearby, making soft babbling sounds that seemed to echo in the large space. Both boys looked pale and thin, as if grief had stolen their appetites along with their peace. Clara's heart clenched at the sight of them. They looked so small and lost in the enormous house, like 2 little boats adrift in an endless ocean. "Hello there," she said softly, setting the breakfast tray on a nearby table. William looked up with startled eyes, unused to gentle voices from strangers. Edmund continued his crawling, but glanced her way with curious brown eyes that reminded Clara, painfully, of his father. "Are you hungry?" she asked, kneeling down to William's level. "I made fresh bread this morning, with butter and honey." The little boy's stomach growled audibly, but he shook his head and hugged his wooden horse tighter. Clara understood. Sometimes when people were too sad, even good things felt scary. "That's all right," she said gently. "Maybe later." She was about to stand when Edmund crawled over and pulled himself up, using her skirt for support. The baby looked up at her with such trust and hope that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. Without thinking, she reached down and gently smoothed his dark hair. "Mama?" Edmund whispered, the word barely audible but sharp as a knife through Clara's heart. "No, sweetheart," she whispered back. "I'm Clara, but I'm here, and I think you're the bravest little boys in all of Montana." At that moment, Robert Hartwell appeared at the top of the staircase, his hair disheveled and his clothes wrinkled from another sleepless night. His eyes took in the scene below, his sons, his servant, the moment of connection between them, and something flickered across his face. Surprise? Relief? Fear? "What are you doing?" His voice cut through the gentle morning air like a blade. Clara stood quickly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I was just bringing your breakfast, sir. The children were here, and I." "The children have a nursemaid," Robert said coldly, though Clara had never seen any evidence of this mysterious caregiver. "They don't need attention from the kitchen staff." But as he spoke, both William and Edmund had moved closer to Clara, as if her presence brought them some small measure of comfort in their confused, grief-filled world. The sight of his sons seeking solace from a stranger seemed to hit Robert Hartwell like a physical blow. For a long moment, father and servant stared at each other across the vast hallway, 2 adults who wanted nothing more than to heal 2 broken little hearts, but had no idea how to bridge the gap between their different worlds. The nursery door creaked open just enough for Clara to slip inside like a shadow. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Robert Hartwell, the man who commanded thousands of cattle and hundreds of workers, sat hunched over in a wooden chair, his head buried in his hands while his sons screamed around him. William stood in his crib, his tiny fists gripping the wooden rails so tight his knuckles had turned white. Tears streamed down his red face as he called out, "Mama! Mama!" over and over. Baby Edmund lay on his back in the other crib, his whole body shaking with each sob that tore from his throat. The sound was like nothing Clara had ever heard. The reasons, pure heartbreak from souls too young to understand why their world had suddenly become so dark and empty. Robert looked up when he heard the floorboards squeak under Clara's feet, His eyes went wide with surprise, then narrow with anger. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice rough and tired. "I told Mrs. Henderson that no one was to come upstairs." Clara felt her heart beating fast, but she didn't back down. She held up a small tray with 2 cups of warm milk. "I thought the little ones might be hungry, sir. Sometimes when children cry this much, it's because their bellies hurt." "Get out," Robert said, standing up from his chair. He was much taller than Clara, and his shadow fell across her like a dark cloud. "I don't need some kitchen girl telling me how to handle my own sons." But Clara had already moved toward William's crib. The little boy looked at her with eyes so sad and lost that it nearly broke her heart in 2. "Hello there, sweet boy," she whispered in her soft Irish accent. "Would you like something warm to drink?" William stopped crying for just a moment. Curious about this new person who spoke so gently, Clara reached into the crib and carefully lifted him out, even though she could feel Robert watching her every move like a hawk watches a mouse. "You have no right," Robert said, but his voice was quieter now. "You don't know anything about my family." "I know about children who hurt," Clara replied, settling William on her hip while she picked up one of the milk cups. "I know they need comfort when the world feels too big and scary." She began to hum a soft melody her own mother had sung to her long ago in Ireland. It was a song about brave little sailors who found their way home, even in the darkest storms. William's head drooped against her shoulder, and his crying slowly turned into tiny hiccups. Robert stared at them, his mouth hanging open slightly. "How did you do that?" "Sometimes all they need is to know someone cares," Clara said, offering William the warm milk. He took small sips, his eyes never leaving her face. Edmund was still crying in his crib, so Clara moved over to him next, still holding William. "And what about you, little prince?" she asked, looking down at the baby. "Are you missing your mama too?" She began to rock gently back and forth, humming the same tune. Something magical seemed to happen in that small room, lit only by flickering candles. The harsh sounds of crying slowly faded away, replaced by the soft melody that seemed to wrap around all of them like a warm blanket. Robert sat back down in his chair, watching in amazement as his sons, who had cried every single night for 6 long months, began to calm down in the arms of this stranger. "I don't understand," he whispered. "I've tried everything. I've bought them new toys, hired different nursemaids, even brought in a doctor from back east. Nothing worked. Money can't buy what they need most," Clara said gently, still rocking both boys. "They need to feel safe. They need to know that even though their mama is gone, they're not alone in this big, frightening world." William had finished his milk and was now almost asleep against Clara's shoulder. Baby Edmund had stopped crying completely and was making soft cooing sounds as he looked up at her face. "My wife used to sing to them," Robert said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every night before bed, she would sit right where you're sitting and sing them to sleep." "What did she sing?" Clara asked. Robert's eyes filled with tears. "I don't remember the words. I was always too busy with work to listen carefully. I thought I had all the time in the world to learn those songs." His voice broke. "I thought she would always be here to sing them." Clara felt her own eyes getting watery. "Would you like me to teach you some lullabies? Irish mothers have been singing their babies to sleep for hundreds of years. The words are simple, and the melodies are easy to remember." "You would do that?" Robert asked, surprised. "Even though I was rude to you? These little ones need their father," Clara said firmly, "and their father needs to know how to comfort them when the nightmares come." She began to sing softly in Gaelic, then translated the words into English. It was a song about stars watching over children while they slept, keeping bad dreams away until morning came. Robert listened carefully, trying to memorize every word. By the time Clara finished the second verse, both William and Edmund were fast asleep. The nursery, which had been filled with desperate crying just minutes before, was now peaceful and quiet, except for the gentle sound of breathing. "I can't believe it," Robert whispered, staring at his sleeping sons. "They haven't slept through the night since." He couldn't finish the sentence. Children understand more than we think, Clara said softly, carefully laying William back in his crib, and then doing the same with Edmund. They can feel when someone truly cares about them, even if that person is just the kitchen maid. Robert stood up and walked over to where Clara was tucking the boys under their blankets. "You're not just the kitchen maid," he said quietly. "Tonight, you've been their angel." As they tiptoed out of the nursery together, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The deep satisfaction of knowing she had made a real difference in someone's life. But she also felt scared, because she knew that what had happened tonight would change everything, and she had no idea if those changes would be good or terrible. The next morning brought trouble faster than a prairie fire. Mrs. Henderson stood waiting in the kitchen doorway when Clara came down to start breakfast, her face as stern as a judge about to deliver a harsh sentence. "The master wants to see you in his study," she announced, her voice cutting through the early morning silence like a sharp knife. "Right now." Clara's stomach dropped like a stone thrown into a deep well. She had known this moment would come, but she had hoped for at least one peaceful morning before facing the consequences of her midnight visit to the nursery. The other servants gathered in the kitchen doorway to watch her walk toward Robert's study, their faces full of curiosity and worry. Cook shook her head sadly, as if Clara was already packing her bags. James, the stable boy, gave her an encouraging nod, but even he looked concerned. Robert's study was a room that seemed designed to make people feel small. The walls were covered with dark wood panels, and heavy leather books lined the shelves from floor to ceiling. A massive desk sat in the center of the room, covered with papers about cattle prices and land deals. Behind the desk hung a painting of Robert's late wife, Margaret, smiling down at the room with kind eyes. Robert stood with his back to Clara, staring out the window at the vast Montana landscape. His shoulders were tense, and she could tell he was struggling with what to say. "Sit down," he said without turning around. Clara perched on the edge of a leather chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She tried to prepare herself for the angry words she was sure were coming, but Robert surprised her by speaking in a quiet, thoughtful voice. "My son slept for 8 hours straight last night," he said, finally turning to face her. "Do you know how long it's been since that happened?" "No, sir," Clara replied, though she could guess from the dark circles under his eyes. 6 months and 12 days, Robert said, moving to sit behind his desk. "That's how long they've been crying every night. That's how long I've been sitting in that nursery, feeling completely helpless while my children suffered." Clara waited, not sure if she should apologize or explain herself. "The thing is," Robert continued, leaning back in his chair, "I should be angry with you. You disobeyed a direct order. You went somewhere you had no business going. You interfered with family matters that are none of your concern." "Yes, sir," Clara said quietly. "I know I overstepped my place." "But I'm not angry," Robert said, and Clara looked up in surprise. "I'm confused and impressed, and maybe a little bit scared." "Scared, sir?" Robert ran his hands through his hair, making it stick up in different directions. "My wife had a way with the children that I never understood. She could calm them down with just a touch, make them laugh when they were sad, help them feel safe when thunderstorms came through. I always thought it was some kind of magic that only mothers possessed." Clara remained silent, sensing that Robert needed to work through his thoughts out loud. "But last night, I watched you do the exact same things Margaret used to do. You sang to them in a language I don't speak, but somehow they understood every word. You held them like they were made of precious china, but also like they were strong enough to handle whatever troubles come their way. Children need both things," Clara said softly. "They need to feel protected, but they also need to feel brave." "How do you know so much about children?" Robert asked. "Mrs. Henderson told me you're not married and you don't have any of your own." Clara's face went pale, and she looked down at her hands. This was the question she had been dreading, because the answer would reveal the deepest pain of her life. "I had a daughter once," she whispered, so quietly that Robert had to lean forward to hear her. "Back in Ireland. Her name was Molly. and she was the most beautiful little girl who ever lived. What happened to her? Robert asked gently. The hunger came to our village when she was 3 years old, Clara continued, tears beginning to form in her eyes. The potato crops failed for 2 years in a row, and people started starving. I gave Molly every bit of food I could find, but it wasn't enough. She got sick with a fever and, Clara's voice broke. She died in my arms, asking why her belly hurt so much. The study became completely quiet, except for the ticking of the big clock on the mantel. Robert stared at Clara with new understanding in his eyes. That's why you came upstairs last night, he said. You heard my sons crying, and it reminded you of your own child. When children hurt, something inside me breaks, Clara admitted. I know I had no right to interfere, but I couldn't just lie in my bed and listen to their pain without trying to help. Robert was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything Clara had told him. Outside the window, he could see his ranch hands getting ready for another day of work, moving cattle and mending fences. Life on the ranch went on as it always had, but something fundamental had changed overnight. I have a problem, Robert said finally. My sons need what you gave them last night, but society has rules about servants and their place in the household. If word gets out that I'm allowing the kitchen maid to act as a nursemaid to my children, people will talk. I understand, sir, Clara said, starting to stand up. I'll pack my things and be gone by noon. Sit back down, Robert said firmly. I'm not finished. Clara sat, confused by the determination she heard in his voice. Victoria Ashford and her friends think they know what's best for my family, Robert continued. They've been telling me for months that the children need discipline, structure, and distance from the servants. They say I'm too soft, that I should hire a strict governess from back east who will teach the boys proper behavior. Maybe they're right, Clara said reluctantly. Maybe I don't belong in their world. Robert stood up and walked around the desk until he was standing directly in front of Clara. Let me tell you something about Victoria Ashford and women like her, he said. They care more about appearances than they do about actual children. They think love should be measured and controlled, given out in small doses, like expensive medicine. Clara looked up at him, hope beginning to flicker in her chest like a small candle. My sons don't need discipline right now, Robert said. They need healing. They need someone who understands that grief doesn't follow society's rules about proper behavior. They need someone who cares more about their hearts than about what the neighbors think. What are you saying, sir? Clara asked. Robert walked over to his desk and picked up several official-looking papers. I'm saying that maybe it's time to make some changes around here. Changes that will allow you to care for my sons properly, without having to sneak around in the middle of the night. But before Robert could explain what those papers meant, the study door burst open and Mrs. Henderson rushed in, her face flushed with excitement and worry. Mr. Hartwell, sir, she gasped. You need to come quickly. Victoria Ashford and 3 other ladies from town have just arrived for an unannounced visit. They're asking to see the children, and they want to discuss household management with you immediately. Robert's jaw tightened, and Clara felt her heart sink. The moment of hope she had just experienced was about to be crushed by the very people Robert had been talking about. Perfect timing, Robert muttered, then looked at Clara with determination in his eyes. Stay right here. Don't move from this room until I come back. We're not finished with this conversation. As Robert walked toward the door to face the judgmental ladies who had come to interfere with his family, Clara wondered if she would still have a job by the end of the day, or if her brief moment as an angel in the nursery would cost her everything she had worked so hard to build in this new country. The clock in the main hall struck 11, when the sound of fancy carriages rolling up the gravel drive shattered the evening quiet. Clara froze while folding laundry in the servant hall, watching through the small window as 3 elegant women stepped down from their polished coaches. She recognized them immediately. The wives of the territory's most powerful ranchers, led by Victoria Ashford, whose husband owned more land than anyone except Robert himself. They're here for their monthly visit, Mrs. Henderson whispered, rushing past with her arms full of fine china. "Quick, Clara, help me set up the parlor. And remember, speak only when spoken to." But something felt different this time. The women's faces looked stern, their movements sharp like hawks circling prey. Victoria Ashford's eyes swept the house as she entered, taking in every detail with the focus of a general planning an attack. "Robert, darling," Victoria called out sweetly as she removed her gloves. "We simply had to come check on you and those precious boys. The whole territory has been so concerned." Clara carried the tea service into the parlor, her hands steady despite the knots forming in her stomach. She'd served these ladies before, but tonight they watched her every move with unusual interest. Their whispered conversations stopped the moment she entered the room. "Such devoted help you have," commented Mrs. Porter, wife of the banker. Her voice dripped honey, but her eyes were cold as winter streams. "So, involved with the family." Robert sat stiffly in his leather chair, clearly uncomfortable. "The staff has been very helpful during this difficult time." "Oh yes," Victoria smiled, but it looked more like a wolf showing teeth. "We've heard all about how helpful they've been, particularly with the children at night." The teacup rattled against its saucer as Clara set it down. How did they know? She'd been so careful, so quiet during her nighttime visits to the nursery. "Children need routine," Robert replied carefully. "They need structure." "Indeed they do." Victoria leaned forward like a cat ready to pounce. "They need to understand their place in the world, just as everyone else should understand theirs." Mrs. Dalton, the youngest of the three, spoke up with fake concern. "We're only worried about the boys, Robert. What happens when they grow attached to, well, to people who might not always be here? It could be quite damaging." Clara continued serving, but her heart hammered so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. She caught Robert's eye for just a moment and saw something that made her blood run cold. Doubt. "The Irish girl seems sweet enough," Victoria continued, stirring sugar into her tea with slow, deliberate movements. "But really, Robert, allowing servants such liberties with your sons? People throughout the territory are starting to talk." "What kind of talk?" Robert's voice had turned dangerous, the same tone he used when dealing with cattle thieves. Victoria's smile widened. "Oh, nothing terrible. Just questions about whether the Hartwell boys are being raised properly, whether they're learning the right lessons about society and their position in it." Clara felt the room spinning around her. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear entirely, but her feet seemed rooted to the expensive carpet. "You see, Mrs. Stead," Porter added, "children form attachments so easily. They don't understand the difference between family and hired help. It can be quite confusing for their development." "Confusing how?" Robert asked, though Clara could tell he already knew the answer. "Well," Victoria set down her teacup with a delicate clink, "what will happen when the boys are older and realize that their caregiver isn't actually family? That she's just a servant who can be dismissed at any time? The heartbreak could be devastating." The words hit Clara like physical blows. She'd never thought about it that way, about what would happen when William and Edmund grew up and understood the difference between their world and hers. Mrs. Dalton nodded sadly. "And then there's the practical matter. What kind of wives will want to marry boys who've been raised by servants? What kind of families will want to associate with them? The Hartwell name is one of the most respected in Montana Territory," Robert said stiffly. "For now," Victoria agreed. "But reputations can be damaged so easily. One small scandal, one whisper of impropriety, and suddenly doors that were always open begin to close." Clara's hands shook as she refilled the water pitcher. She'd been selfish, she realized. She'd only thought about comforting the children, about easing their pain. She hadn't considered how her presence might hurt them in the future. "Of course, we're not suggesting anything improper has happened, Mrs. O," Porter said quickly. "Just that appearances matter, especially for children who will someday take their place in society." Victoria stood up, smoothing her expensive silk dress. "We only want what's best for William and Edmund. They're such precious boys, and they deserve every advantage in life." As the ladies prepared to leave, Victoria turned to Robert with a final strike. You know, the Ashford family has a wonderful governess for our children. A refined lady from Boston with excellent references. I could speak to her about taking on additional pupils, if you're interested in proper care for the boys. After the carriages disappeared into the night, Robert sat alone in his study, staring at the cold fireplace. Clara found him there an hour later when she came to empty the ashtrays. "Sir?" she whispered. He looked up, and she saw the weight of impossible choices crushing down on him. "Clara, I heard everything," she said quietly. "And they're right." "Are they?" Clara set down her cleaning supplies and faced him directly. "Those boys will grow up in a world I'll never belong to. A world where people judge them for who raised them, who they care about, who they call family." Robert stood up slowly, moving to the window that looked out over his vast lands. When Margaret was alive, none of this mattered. She would have told those women to mind their own business. "But she's not here now," Clara said gently, "and you have to protect your sons' futures, even if it means breaking their hearts." Clara felt her own heart cracking, but she forced herself to smile. "Hearts heal, Mr. Hartwell, but missed opportunities in life, those last forever." Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, Robert turned back to her with eyes full of pain. "I'll write you a good reference letter, help you find another position somewhere far from here." Clara nodded, though tears blurred her vision. "The children won't understand at first." "No," Robert agreed. "They won't." As Clara walked back to her small room, she could hear William calling out in his sleep. Not crying this time, but calling her name. Tomorrow, she would have to find a way to say goodbye to the two little boys who had become her whole world. But tonight, for one last time, she would climb those forbidden stairs and sing them Irish lullabies until they slept peacefully in her arms. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Montana territory, matching the heaviness in Clara's chest as she folded her few belongings into a worn leather satchel. Her hands moved automatically. Extra dress, mended stockings, the small wooden cross her mother had given her before she left Ireland. Each item felt like a goodbye to the life she'd built here. A soft knock interrupted her packing. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Henderson with her final wages. Instead, Robert Hartwell stood in her doorway, looking like he hadn't slept at all. His usually perfect hair was messed up, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes held a wild look she'd never seen before. "They're crying again," he said simply. Clara's heart clenched. "I know. I can hear them. I've been sitting with them for 2 hours. Nothing works. William keeps asking for Clara, and Edmund he just sobs like his world is ending." She looked at her packed bag, then back at Robert's desperate face. "It will get easier for them. Children forget faster than adults." "Do they?" Robert stepped into the small room, his presence making it feel even smaller. "Because I've been thinking all night, and I don't believe that's true. I think we tell ourselves that lie to make the hard choices easier." Clara set down the dress she'd been folding. Something in his voice made her pause, made her really look at him. The powerful cattle baron who controlled thousands of acres and commanded respect from every man in the territory looked lost. "Mr. Hartwell, what Victoria Ashford said was right. I don't belong in your world. Don't you?" He moved closer, his voice intense. "Then why do my sons smile for the first time in months when you walk into a room? Why do they sleep peacefully only after you've told them stories? Why has this house felt more like a home in the past few weeks than it has since Margaret died?" Clara shook her head. "Those are feelings, sir. But society runs on rules, not feelings." "Society?" Robert said the word like it tasted bitter. "Let me tell you what society gave my wife Clara. It gave her strict rules about how to act, how to speak, how to raise children. It gave her pressure to be perfect every moment of every day. And when she got sick, society whispered that it was somehow her fault for not being strong enough." The pain in his voice made Clara's throat tight. She'd never heard him talk about Margaret's death before. Margaret fought those society rules every day of her life, he continued. She wanted to teach the boys Irish songs because she thought they were beautiful. She wanted to let them run barefoot in the grass because she thought they should feel free. But she was always worried about what people would think, what people would say. Robert sat down heavily in the room's only chair, suddenly looking much older than his 35 years. Do you know what she told me the night before she died? Clara shook her head, afraid to speak. She said she regretted listening to society more than her heart. She said she wished she'd been braver about showing William and Edmund that love comes in many forms, not just the ones that society approves of. Tears rolled down Clara's cheeks. But sir, your son's futures will be ruined if I let fear make my decisions for me. Robert stood up abruptly, pacing the small space like a caged animal. I've spent all night thinking about this, Clara. Those women yesterday, they weren't trying to protect my boys. They were trying to control them. What do you mean? Robert's eyes flashed with anger. Victoria Ashford's own children are miserable. Have you seen them? They're scared to speak unless spoken to, scared to play too loudly, scared to show any real emotion. Is that what I want for William and Edmund? Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But the governess, she mentioned, would teach my sons to be ashamed of gentleness, would teach them that caring about people below their social class is weakness. Robert stopped pacing and looked directly at her. Margaret would have hated that. A long silence stretched between them. From upstairs, they could still hear the children's cries, weaker now, but heartbreaking in their exhaustion. So what are you saying? Clara asked quietly. Robert pulled out a folded paper from his vest pocket. I'm saying I spent the morning writing letters, one to my lawyer in Helena, one to the territorial government, and one to my bank. Clara stared at the papers. I don't understand. I'm creating a new position in this household. Not a servant, not exactly family, but something in between. A governess position, but with more authority than usual. Your own cottage on the property, a salary that reflects your importance to my sons, and a legal contract that protects your position. Clara's legs felt weak. She sat down on her bed, the packed satchel forgotten. Mr. Hartwell, that's impossible. Is it? Robert unfolded the papers, showing her official-looking documents with government seals. Because according to territorial law, a rancher has the right to hire whatever staff he deems necessary for his property and his family's welfare. She read over the papers with growing amazement. The position he'd created for her was unlike anything she'd ever heard of. Part teacher, part caretaker, part family advisor. The salary was more than some men made in a year. But the other ranchers' wives can complain all they want, Robert said firmly, but they can't argue with legal documents and territorial law. What I'm offering you is a legitimate position that even Victoria Ashford can't attack without looking foolish. Clara looked up at him, hope and fear warring in her chest. And if they tried to make trouble anyway? Robert's smile was sharp as a knife. Then they'll discover that the Hartwell Ranch controls the water rights for 3 other properties, including the Ashford land. Amazing how civil people become when their cattle need water. Despite everything, Clara found herself smiling. That's rather ruthless, sir. I learned from the best cattle barons in the territory, Robert said. Sometimes you have to fight dirty to protect what matters. From upstairs, William's voice called out again, not crying now, but calling for Papa and Cara with equal desperation. So what do you say, Clara Murphy? Robert held out the official papers. Will you be my son's governess? Will you help me raise them to be strong enough to follow their hearts instead of society's rules? Clara looked at the contract, at the man who was offering her a chance at a life she'd never dared dream of, at the stairs that led to 2 little boys who needed her. The choice should have been impossible. Society's disapproval, the risk of scandal, the uncertainty of a position that had never existed before. But as William's voice called for her again, Clara realized that some choices weren't really choices at all. They were simply recognizing what your heart had already decided. Yes, she whispered. Then stronger. Yes, Mr. Hartwell. I'll be their governess. As she spoke, the crying upstairs stopped completely, as if the children somehow sensed that their world had just become safe again. The morning sun blazed through the ranch house windows like fire through glass, but Robert Hartwell barely noticed as he paced his study with papers clutched in his trembling hands. 3 sleepless nights had passed since Victoria Ashford's cruel words, and the decision he was about to make would either save his family or destroy everything they had built together. Clara stood in the doorway, her small traveling bag at her feet, waiting for the dismissal she knew must come. The children's laughter echoed from the kitchen where Mrs. Henderson was trying desperately to distract them with sweet rolls and warm milk. But even she knew this happiness wouldn't last much longer. "I've been thinking," Robert said, his voice rough as winter wind. He turned to face her, and Clara saw something new in his weathered features. Not the cold distance of a master speaking to a servant, but the raw honesty of a man who had finally found his courage. "About what the town ladies said?" Clara asked quietly. "About how wrong this all is?" "About how right it is," he corrected, stepping closer. "About how my sons haven't cried themselves to sleep in 3 weeks. About how William actually smiled yesterday when he saw a butterfly in the garden. About how little Edmund tried to say your name, and it was the first real word he's spoken since his mother died." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Mr. Hartwell, I don't understand." "I'm making you their governess," he said, holding up the official papers. "Not their nursemaid, not their temporary comfort, their real legal governess, with a proper salary, and your own cottage on the property." The words hit Clara like lightning striking an open field. A governess was respectable work, still below the family's station, but acceptable in polite society. Ladies might whisper, but they couldn't openly condemn it. "But why would you do such a thing?" she whispered. "You could hire someone with proper training, someone from back east with fine manners and education." "Because they don't love my sons," Robert said simply. "And my sons don't love them." From the kitchen came the sound of running feet, and suddenly William burst through the study door, his face bright with morning mischief. "Papa, Clara, Mrs. Henderson says we're having pancakes shaped like horses." The little boy launched himself at Clara's knees, wrapping his arms around her skirts with the fierce love that only children possess. Behind him toddled Edmund, babbling happily as he reached for Clara's outstretched hands. "You see," Robert said softly, watching his sons cling to the woman who had become their anchor in a storm-tossed world. "This isn't about what's proper anymore. This is about what's necessary." Clara lifted Edmund into her arms while William pressed against her side, and for a moment the study felt like the safest place on earth. But reality crept back in, like winter cold seeping through window cracks. "The other families won't accept it," she warned. "They'll make life difficult for you, for the boys when they're older." "Let them try," Robert said, and there was steel in his voice now, the same strength that had built a cattle empire from nothing. "I've faced down rustlers and blizzards and bank loans that could have ruined me. I think I can handle a few gossiping ranch wives." William looked up at Clara with serious blue eyes. "Are you going away, Clara?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Clara looked at Robert, then down at the child, whose trust had changed everything. "Not if your papa says I can stay," she answered carefully. "I want you to stay forever and ever," William declared, with the absolute certainty that only small children could manage. "And teach me more songs in the magic language." "Irish?" Clara corrected gently. "It's called Irish. Will you teach me too?" Robert asked suddenly, surprising them all. "I'd like to understand the lullabies you sing to them." The simple request broke something open in Clara's chest. Here was this powerful man, humbling himself to learn her native tongue so he could better connect with his own children. "I'd be honored to," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The rest of the morning passed in a whirlwind of arrangements. Robert called his lawyer to make the governess position official. Mrs. Henderson, initially shocked by the news, slowly warmed to the idea when she saw how the children glowed with happiness. The other servants whispered among themselves, but none dared speak against something that brought such obvious joy to the household. By afternoon, Clara found herself standing in the doorway of a small but charming cottage at the edge of the main property, her new home. It had a stone fireplace, polished wooden floors, and windows that looked out over the rolling grasslands where cattle grazed like scattered clouds. "It's not much," Robert said, suddenly awkward. "But it's yours. Really yours." Clara ran her fingers along the smooth wooden table that sat beneath the largest window. After years of sleeping in servants' quarters and owning nothing but the clothes on her back, having a place to call home felt like discovering buried treasure. "It's perfect," she said honestly. "More than I ever dreamed of having." That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Clara tucked William and Edmund into their beds in the main house nursery. But instead of the desperate clinging of previous nights, they settled peacefully, secure in the knowledge that she would still be there tomorrow. "Tell us about the cottage fairy," William requested sleepily. Clara smiled, making up the story as she went. "Well, there once was a fairy who lived in a little stone cottage, and her job was to watch over two brave little princes while they slept." From the doorway, Robert listened to the gentle cadence of her voice weaving magic from simple words. When the boys finally drifted off to sleep, he walked Clara to her new home under a sky full of stars. "Thank you," he said as they reached her door, "for everything you've given them. Given us." "Thank you," she replied, "for seeing past what I am to who I could be." As Clara settled into her cottage that first night, listening to the peaceful sounds of cattle lowing in distant fields, she marveled at how quickly life could change. Yesterday, she had been preparing to pack her few belongings and disappear into the world with nothing but heartbreak as a companion. Tonight, she was a governess with her own home, responsible for raising two little boys who had become as precious to her as if they were her own flesh and blood. But as she drifted off to sleep, one question lingered in her mind like the last note of a lullaby. What would happen when the rest of the territory learned about Robert Hartwell's shocking decision to elevate a servant to such an important position in his household? Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the Montana territory in snow so deep that travel between ranches became nearly impossible, which suited Clara just fine, since it meant fewer opportunities for disapproving neighbors to visit and judge the unusual arrangement at the Hartwell Ranch. Inside the warm cottage that had become her sanctuary, Clara sat before a crackling fire with William and Edmund, teaching them to braid grass into small baskets while she told them stories of her childhood in Ireland. The boys had grown rosy-cheeked and sturdy over the past months, their laughter now a daily soundtrack to life on the ranch. "Tell us again about the giant who lived in the mountain," Edmund requested, his small fingers working carefully with the dried grass. At almost 2 years old, he was talking in full sentences now, his vocabulary rich with both English words and Irish phrases that Clara had taught him. "Ah, that old giant was lonely, you see," Clara began, her voice taking on the musical cadence she used for storytelling. "He lived all by himself in a great stone castle, with no one to talk to but the wind and the ravens." "Like Papa was lonely?" William asked with the startling insight that children sometimes possess. Clara paused in her braiding, caught off guard by the boy's observation. "Perhaps a little like that," she admitted carefully. Through the cottage window, she could see Robert approaching through the snow, his tall form bundled in a heavy coat. He had taken to visiting the cottage most evenings, ostensibly to check on his son's progress with their lessons, but Clara suspected he enjoyed the peaceful atmosphere as much as the children did. "Good evening, Miss Murphy," he said formally, as he stamped snow from his boots at the door, a politeness they maintained even though their relationship had grown far beyond the boundaries of employer and employee. "Good evening, Mr. Hartwell," she replied with equal formality, though her eyes sparkled with warmth. The boys were just learning about patience from an old Irish tale. "Patience," Robert repeated thoughtfully, as he settled into the chair Clara had begun keeping ready for him. "That's something I'm still working on myself." The months had changed him as much as they had changed his sons. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened, and he laughed more easily now. The rigid formality that had once defined him was giving way to something more genuine, more human. "Papa, look!" Edmund held up his completed grass basket with obvious pride. "I made it all by myself." "That's fine work, son," Robert said, examining the small creation with the same serious attention he might give to a cattle contract. "Your mother would have been proud of your careful hands." It was the first time in months that he had mentioned Margaret without pain shadowing his features. Clara noticed the change and felt a quiet satisfaction bloom in her chest, like spring flowers pushing through snow. She would have loved seeing them learn these old skills, Clara said softly. "There's something peaceful about working with your hands, creating something useful from simple materials." "You'd know about creating something from simple materials," Robert said, and there was something in his voice that made Clara look up sharply from her own basket. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you took two broken little boys and a stubborn fool of a father, and somehow created a family from the pieces." The words hung in the air like snowflakes, delicate and precious. William looked back and forth between the adults, sensing something important in the way they were looking at each other. "Are we a real family now?" he asked, with innocent directness. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The question touched on everything they had all been carefully avoiding, the growing bonds between them that had nothing to do with employer and employee, nothing to do with social conventions or proper arrangements. "You are brothers," Robert said carefully, "and Clara is. Clara is the person who takes care of you and teaches you and loves you like a mama?" Edmund asked hopefully. The simple question shattered the careful walls they had all been building around their feelings. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized how much she had come to love these boys, how completely they had filled the empty space in her heart left by her own lost child. "Like someone who will always, always be part of your lives," she managed to say around the tightness in her throat. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep in their beds at the main house and Clara had returned to her cottage, she found Robert waiting for her on the front porch, his face serious in the moonlight. "We need to talk," he said quietly. They walked together through the snow-covered garden, their breath forming white clouds in the crisp air. The silence stretched between them, comfortable, but charged with unspoken possibilities. "The boys aren't the only ones who've changed," Robert said finally. "This arrangement we made, it was supposed to be about giving them stability, proper care, a respectable solution to an impossible situation." "Yes," Clara agreed carefully, sensing dangerous ground ahead. But somewhere along the way, it became about more than that. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "At least, it has for me." Clara's heart began hammering against her ribs. "Robert, I know it's impossible," he said quickly. "I know the difference in our stations, the scandal it would cause, the problems it would create for the boys when they're older. I know all of that. Then why are you saying this?" "Because I've learned something important from watching you with my sons," he said. "I've learned that love doesn't follow society's rules about what's proper or appropriate. Love just is." They stood facing each other in the snow-covered garden, two people who had found something precious and impossible, something that could never be acknowledged openly, but could never be entirely denied either. "The boys need us both," Clara said finally. "That has to be enough." "For now," Robert agreed. "But Clara, when they're grown, when they don't need us hovering over them every moment, when the scandal wouldn't touch them." He let the unfinished sentence hang between them like a promise. Clara smiled through tears she didn't try to hide. "When that day comes, we'll see what kind of future we can build together." Years passed, like seasons turning, and the arrangement that had once shocked the neighbors became simply part of the landscape of the Hartwell Ranch. William grew tall and serious, with his father's head for business and his mother's gentle heart. Edmund became the dreamer, the storyteller, the one who remembered every Irish song Clara had ever taught him. The three adults who raised them learned to navigate the complex boundaries of their unusual family with grace and patience. Clara remained officially the governess. Robert remained the devoted father, and their deeper feelings remained carefully unspoken, but never entirely hidden. And on quiet evenings, when snow covered the Montana territory like a blessing, they would gather in Clara's cottage or around the fire in the main house, creating new memories from the same simple materials Clara had always worked with: love, patience, and the radical belief that family could be built from the most unlikely foundations. In the end, Clara Murphy discovered that worth wasn't measured by society's approval, but by the love you were brave enough to give and the lives you were blessed enough to touch. And in the vast expanse of the American West, where anything seemed possible under the endless sky, even the most impossible dreams sometimes found a way to take root and grow.